All right. Well, welcome everyone to our teaching of pronunciation interest group professional development session. We're so pleased to have our topic of pronunciation journeys, a 10-year second language teacher trajectories, and this is going to be brought to us by Dr. Michael Burry, University of Wollongong in Australia. But guess what? He is not there at this moment. If I'm not mistaken, Dr. Burry, you are in
I'm
Japan.
in Japan. Yeah,
Right,
I'm
where
in
the time
Osaka.
is a bit earlier, right?
Oh, it's 6:30. It's not too bad.
All right, so that is in the morning. And then we've got people here who are from different areas, different states of the US, as well as different countries. So we have a lot of different time zones. But everyone here, I'm sure, is interested in the teaching and learning of pronunciation. So we are so happy at Katisal Talk to have these opportunities to present to you. I am Marcia Chan. I am the co-founder and a coordinator of our topic professional development group, along with,
Hi everyone, I'm Patrick. I'm the co-coordinator of TOP.
yes, that's true. And where are you?
I'm originally from Poland.
Mhm.
So I see that we have a participant from the Czech Republic or Czechia. So we used to be neighbors, but I'm currently based in Portland, Oregon, after having lived in California for almost a decade.
Yes, yes. Okay. And as you may know, there are Katisal members from California and from outside of California because we're such a great group. Our co-coordinator is Randy Reitmeyer. Is Randy here today? Not here right now. Okay, so we have a top Padlet. Patrick, if you'll put that up in the chat window, please. This is to let everyone know that you can get access to our top Padlet 24/7. And in this Padlet, you'll find some information about our group. We started 10 years ago. And we also have a number of resources, lots of resources, some that are in slide format, PDF format, and many that are in video format. So we have a habit of recording our sessions and editing them and putting them up so that you can review them or view them for the first time as you like. So take a look at the top Padlet and you'll be able to keep up with where we have been and what we're up to next. We have a Facebook group, so if there are some of you who are Facebook members, we would invite you to join us. We have some posts there from our membership as well as other people who are interested in pronunciation who are maybe not yet members of Katisal. We also have a topic e-list, which is a place for you to get information about our upcoming events. So I know a lot of us get tons of email, and sometimes we get email that's full of a lot of different things, but we're just interested in what's going on in topic and pronunciation elements that might be useful to us as teachers of pronunciation. So whether you are a member of Katisal or not, you are very welcome to join this newsletter, and we'll send you like once a month, something that's coming up. And it's at our tinyurl.com/Katisal Talk. All right, so I'm going to give it over to Mike, who's going to tell us all about his research project. Welcome, Mike Burry.
Thank you, Marcia. Just bear with me as I share the screen here.
Right?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So again, thank you for having me. This is a really good, a wonderful opportunity for me to share some of the findings of this 10-year study. It's a mountain of data that we've collected, and I'll talk about that in a second. It's not just me here. And so this is very much sort of preliminary in a sense that I'm exploring what the data actually may mean, and you might help me to figure that out as we go through. And there's hopefully plenty of time to ask questions at the end. So if you got questions, put them in the chat, and then we'll discuss at the end if you may wish. Cool. So let me go to the next slide if that works. Yes, good. So what are we going to do? Very, very straightforward. Just very briefly give a bit of background. What are we trying to do? Then I'll give you a little bit of the sort of the overview of the study, because that I referred to that throughout the talk here. Then I think the main part we're going to spend on findings, and then we'll have a little bit of time, as I said, for discussion and of course questions at the end. So as mentioned, this is not just about me. I do want to acknowledge Amanda Bakers. You might be familiar with Amanda's work. She's been very instrumental in helping me or us figure out what's going on. Amanda's collected data with me, and also Honglin Chen. She was very much involved in the early stage, because that was phase 1, as you'll see. That was originally my doctorate, and Honglin was co-supervising me, so she was very, very helpful and provided great guidance here. So I do want to acknowledge these people. This is not about me. Background, what's happening? So just to establish sort of a bit of the scene here, there's a lot of research and scholars saying we need more longitudinal studies, particularly framed within a second, SLTE means here, second language teacher education context. We need that. And so there is some, but really limited longitudinal research on second language teachers' professional trajectories. There's some studies, but again, there needs to be done a lot more work. Longitudinal studies on teaching pronunciation are very scarce. There's my work, there's most of it has actually been done within a teacher education context. So Bas, Kochum, there's a few studies within second language teacher education, but they're not necessarily longitudinal studies. They've sort of not gone beyond the teacher education context. There is also what we need to mention, and many of you know this already, there's a lot of resources, handbooks, the PSLLT, proceedings, conference, and so on, available now. There's symposiums in Europe, and we hosted one in Australia not long ago. But many teachers around the world continue to struggle with teaching pronunciation. Research done in many countries shows this. What we don't know, and at least you might have seen me, let me know, what we don't know is what actually happened to pronunciation when COVID hit. There's not much research published on this yet. And so hopefully I'll show you a little bit what the data has in this regard. And also then what happens to pronunciation after the COVID pandemic, sort of after we went back to face-to-face teaching, right? We sort of abandoned face-to-face teaching, went online, emergency online teaching, and then we went back to face-to-face. So that transition is really not documented, at least based on what I've seen in regards to pronunciation teaching. So what are we trying to do here? Really, we're trying to explore professional trajectories, as the title suggests, obviously. But that's not trajectories. But what I want to do is I also want to focus on teachers' pronunciation practices and cognitions. Now, some of you may hang on. Why is there an S? Cognitions. In my work, I look at cognitions to really trying to identify teaches different types of knowledge and beliefs. Now, I draw heavily, of course, on Simon Bork's work, cognition, and also I use, Kubanyo and Ferriok's work in the Modern Language Journal, the special issue there, and many other studies have followed that. They generally use cognition, but again, I use cognitions. And if you're interested in that, I'll be happy to talk about that more, why that is actually the case. And then I also want to identify anything, but anything, I'm struggling to put a word to it. Is it factors? Is it events? Is it occurrences? Anything that really shaped these teachers' trajectories along the way, right? And I have a long list that I'll share with you at some point. So what does the study actually look like? It's a wordy slide, but I'll walk you through through this. The initial stage was the teacher education context. So the teachers, the participants, were graduate students in a pronunciation course, right? That took place in 2013, so 10 years ago. They took a 4 months pronunciation course, and basically I collected every word that was written, every word that was spoken in that course. As you'll see here, we got questionnaires, we got post questionnaires, focus groups, 15 focus groups we did. I observed every class. There was the final interview with all the participants, and then I collected their final assignment. There was 15 student teachers. Then afterwards, they finished their graduate degrees, they went off and started teaching. I gave them a narrative frame to report their practices. I couldn't go and visit them, so it was self-reported practices. Then I was lucky to get a grant, and I observed them, some in Japan, some in Australia. I observed them, I interviewed them, and I gave their students a questionnaire. That was 6 years after their postgraduate studies. Then the pandemic hit, and obviously we couldn't visit them anymore. So we interviewed them on Zoom. That was in 2020, when lockdowns were taking place all over the world. And then we did another round in 21. Still, many places were in lockdown, particularly the Melbourne area, as many of you know. Again, we did that on Zoom. And then last year, that was not long ago, just a few months ago, we interviewed the teachers again, and some of them on Zoom because they were not close to Wollongong, and some of them we did face-to-face. So there was a whole range of data we collected over the last 10 years, and I mentioned a mountain of data, so you probably get a bit of a sense now what I meant by that. Just an enormous amount of data we collected. What do we do with all this data? I don't want to spend too much time, but basically we analyzed all the data thematically. Okay, so we got a whole range of themes. The initial phase 1 and 2, the graduate course and then the narrative frame, Amanda and I designed a rubric that then we used to sort of analyze profiles of these teachers, and we created data, what I'm looking for, numerical data, that's the word I'm looking for. And that created a graph that I'll share in a moment. And we're in the process now of writing really detailed profiles to then showcase those trajectories over a 10-year period. But that's very much in progress. And I'll show you a couple of graphs here and images, what we're working on. So what did we find? I think that's what you're probably most interested in. In phase 1, remember, that's the graduate course. 15 student teachers participated. What we found was that a pronunciation pedagogy course had a real profound impact on a lot of these student teachers. If you're interested, by the way, if you're interested in some of these papers, just get in touch and I'll be more than happy to share some of those. Some of them are open access, some are not. But again, I'll be happy to share them. So what did we find? As I said, the course had a real impact on these student teachers. And we then, because with that data, then we drew this model here. What is learning to teach pronunciation? Well, that consists of a number of factors. In the center, there's very much intertwined the teacher's beliefs and knowledge intertwined with their identity. But that whole process of learning to teach pronunciation is impacted by personal, professional factors, by language factors, such as many teachers, particularly what was interesting, many native, that's a contested term, of course, but many native English speakers found intonation very challenging to learn. So that was really interesting. And the experienced non-native speakers, again, I acknowledge the terminology here is not as clear-cut and contested. The experienced non-native speakers didn't really struggle with intonation because A, they knew what it was, but they also had taught it previously. And so that was very much intertwined with also teacher preparation factors like assignments and readings. A lot of the readings had very strong impacts on these teachers. And so this model was sort of really nicely captured what learning to teach pronunciation was all about. And this, of course, in this particular context, now, if you replicated this study, say in North America, you might end up with a slightly different model. So that's good news. Then the teachers left the graduate course, so they graduated and started teaching. That's when we gave them the narrative frames. Interestingly, as you'll see in a second here, the learning was very steep during the graduate course, and then they started teaching and started their trajectory, their learning trajectory, if you may wish to call it that, started to taper off slightly. And this, as I mentioned, yeah, we created a rubric, and then we looked at the teachers' profiles and rated their profiles, and that allowed us to then profile 1 at the beginning of the graduate course, profile 2 at the end of the graduate course, and then, as you'll see, a few years later, 3-4 years later, we rated them again. That then allowed us to draw these lines here, and you may notice here that this steep increase, as I just mentioned, and then it started to taper off, slow down. In some cases, it went down. And that, when we looked at that initially, we thought, oh, so they're starting to forget. They aren't really applying what they learned in the graduate course, right? But the good news, I think, is that if you look at it overall, there is a gradual increase in these trajectories, right? So if you just look at it holistically, if you want to call it that, holistically, there's this upward trend. So that was good news. Now, the other thing, of course, you probably noticed is that initially there was 15 graduate students participating in the study. Now we had only 5. That was basically 10 didn't want to continue. Some dropped out. We never heard of them again. Some didn't get into teaching. They started doing something else, which is also an interesting scenario. And I'm in the process of interviewing these people to see what happened there. That's a bit of a different study, but that's still related to some extent. So this was sort of the first study where we saw, oh, okay, something's happening here in the transition from a graduate course that focused just purely on pronunciation to pronunciation teaching in the early stages of teachers' careers. And granted, these practices we looked at, they were self-reported, because again, we couldn't go and observe them, talk to them, and they would report it in the form of a narrative frame. But that was interesting data to see what's happening with these teachers. Then phase 3, now, as I said, now we got a grant and we could talk to these people. We could go and observe them. We could talk to their students, and we got a real in-depth understanding of what was actually happening. Now, in that phase 3, another one dropped out, and we remained with 4. And you can see quite a wide range of participants. One was in Japan teaching at junior high. One was in the Victoria area in Melbourne, originally from Iran. One was the bottom 2 were in New South Wales, and they were very, very experienced teachers. Their experiences pre-graduate course even ranging from 5 to 20 years of some of it was pronunciation, limited pronunciation, but very experienced practitioners. And I think many of you, if you're teaching graduate students or if you're in teacher training, I think that's very representative of people we get in Australia, teachers from all over the world with various backgrounds at all ages. So very interesting. Very interesting then, of course, to follow these teachers along the way. That's exactly what we did. So what did we find when we observed the teachers? You can see it here. I'll summarize. What we started to see the context as they gained more experience teaching pronunciation. The context shaped their practices and their cognitions quite significantly. And also what we started to notice was these trajectories sort of started to diverge. All of them went into different directions professionally. And that, of course, also had very much implications on in terms of how and what they taught pronunciation in the classrooms. And then that forced us, remember I don't want to skip too much, but that model that we drew about learning to teach pronunciation, we had to go back and revisit this, and we revised it. So now we had an additional factor on the outside, the context, okay? And you might also notice we added practices here. So the cognitions, the teacher's beliefs and knowledge, their identities, and their practices were inseparable. They were intertwined, and they really formed that core of who a pronunciation teacher was and what they did. And on the outside, we still had these professional factors, personal professional factors, like things they were interested in, teacher professional preparation factors, language factors, their own language, but also language in relation to, English they taught in the classroom. What was the students' expectations? The Japanese teachers, of course, very much struggled with that because they had to teach American English, but they were Japanese. So that impacted them very much. And then the contextual factors. So things like their learners' needs and goals, their learners' proficiency. So a couple of the participants, they had very proficient students. Others had very low level proficiency students. So that again impacted very much how and what they taught. And program constraints like teachers they had to collaborate with was very important. They couldn't just go and teach whatever they wanted. They had to be in sync with their colleagues. Or textbooks, they had to teach to the textbook. They had assessments along the way they had to meet. They couldn't just teach pronunciation. They had to teach very specific things that were on the test. So those contextual factors were very strong. And because of that, and we, as I said, we revised this model and drew up a 3D model, which is very challenging to draw in Word, but that has nothing to do with the study. But anyway, that was a challenge in itself. A very interesting model that we then published in Applied Linguistics. And again, I'd be more than happy to share that article if you're interested. That was then, now we have pronunciation pedagogy course, initial pronunciation teaching, and now sort of the more experienced phase. And again, very wordy, but I'm summarizing this. What the data also allowed us was now to go in and code very carefully the techniques these participants used and the type of feedback they provided. And you can see here, every teacher was unique. And so the Japanese teacher teaching junior high, she used a lot of techniques. She used all sorts of very scaffolded way. She started off with language awareness, then control techniques, guided techniques, and free techniques. A very wide repertoire, but then relatively few types of feedback, mostly directed at the whole class. And almost all of it was recasts and really explicit correction, class correction, not individual. In contrast, Rio, who taught refugees and migrants in the state of Victoria in Australia, very low level literacy, pre-literacy level often, he used very few techniques. Almost all of them, were reading aloud. And the majority of pronunciation teaching took place through error correction, like recasts and prompts. He would often ask the students when they said, for example, banana, I like bananas. He said, "You like bananas?" And so the students then self-corrected them, right? Or corrected themselves. So he prompted them instead of just explicitly corrected, or sometimes he recast. But essentially, his entire approach to pronunciation teaching was the provision of oral corrective feedback. And then Lucy, she taught in an English intensive center. That's where students come to Australia. They go through these English intensive centers, and then they go off into high schools. They often stay for a year. Some of them are very, very low. Some of refugees that have never been to school. And then you get international students who have basically formal education in China and Korea and Japan. So it's a very big variety, diversity in the classroom. She used all of the techniques were essentially controlled. So she's very teacher-centered. She provided a lot of oral feedback, but almost all of it was provided in reading aloud tasks. So the students read from the textbook, and she corrected them as they read from the textbook. So again, very, very different to what the other two were doing. And then the last one, Georgia, she was teaching. Very interestingly, as you'll see, she moved away from teaching into administration. But she loved pronunciation, and so she started a pronunciation seminar for master's and PhD students that then I observed. That was a 5-week program. The students came to the class once a week. It was a lunch session. And she used a lot of different techniques, a lot of haptic, as you may know. I've been working with Bill Acton and Amanda Baker and others on haptic pronunciation teaching, so movement and touch, tactile pronunciation teaching. She used a lot of those, but also role plays. They clapped, they gap filled, she did dictations. She used a lot of examples of her own Italian learning experience and then linked that to pronunciation teaching. So very interesting scenario. We didn't code it because all of it was pronunciation teaching. So we couldn't just go in and code that. You would have ended up here with hundreds of different things. So we just looked at her holistically at that pronunciation teaching seminar. But again, every teacher, what we started to realize was every teacher was on a sort of an individual, unique trajectory, a pedagogical trajectory, and of course, professional trajectory too. Now, I've been talking for a while. I'm going to throw a question here, and you can put the answer in the chat here. What do you think happened to pronunciation teaching when COVID or the lockdowns particularly hit? What happened here? These teachers were experienced teachers. They've done a graduate degree. They've done a pronunciation pedagogy course. They started teaching in their contexts. And now COVID hits unexpectedly. Boom, remote, emergency remote teaching. I think that's the term that's often used in the literature here now. What happened to pronunciation teaching? Okay, so Carolyn said it was asynchronously. Yeah, it was done asynchronously. Good. A combination of less pronunciation teaching. Pamela said a combination of less teaching, more self-recording assignments. Yeah, good. Interesting. Patrick said, I assume instruction became less embodied. Yeah, absolutely. Good. More recorded assignments, delayed feedback. Yeah. A lot of depended on how familiar, comfortable the teachers were with online teaching. Very good point. I'll come back to that. Students grew in listening abilities. Interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Not much non-verbal gesture teaching. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm actually really interested in that now that we still teach online, right? It's not gone away. What's happening here with that interpersonal element of using gestures in pronunciation teaching? Very interesting. Great, cool, good work. And we can, of course, revisit this question later on. That was actually the question that we were really interested in. And so we connected with these teachers on Zoom, everybody from home, of course, being in lockdown. What did we find? That was a bit of a shock, to be honest. Pronunciation teaching stopped entirely. It just, nobody taught pronunciation anymore. And then I'll show you why. And that has not been published. We're working on something, so I can't really share anything other than the presentation here. But have a look at these quotes here. So Lucy, she was the one that taught in the Intensive English Center with students who had never been to school, refugees who had enormous trauma, who had they had no access to technology. They couldn't read. A lot of them had no. The only thing they had was a cell phone, so they didn't know how to use Zoom, for example. So she said, pronunciation teaching. As soon as they hit the lockdown, pronunciation teaching was the least of her worries. Right. That was not on the radar anymore. Her priority was the well-being of the students. They were locked down at home with families who couldn't speak English. The only thing eventually she managed to do was connect with them on WhatsApp. But these students, many of them spoke no English, so they had to do a three-way call with a student, the teacher, and the translator here. Now you can imagine how difficult that is, and it makes completely sense why pronunciation, in fact, why all teaching essentially became irrelevant. She was just worried about the students. And the student in Japan, which also that surprised me probably the most, is what there was no pronunciation at all. In fact, there was no teaching for 2 months. There was just nothing at all. They had no, and you can't blame them, but they were not prepared for this scenario. The students had no technology. There was no platform to use, such as like we use Moodle. We were fairly well off because we just used Moodle that we'd been using anyway, but they didn't have any medium to communicate. They had to set up Google Classroom. The students didn't know how to do this. So there was no class for 2 weeks, for 2 months. They called the students. And so again, in that context, it made sense. Pronunciation disappeared, right? Really interesting stuff. And yet the teachers kept going, and I'll be happy to share a little bit more about this. I think the slides down the road show a little bit more information here. Then a year later, so that was interesting data. We thought, wow, this is Amanda and I did these interviews. Amanda and I, again on Zoom, looked at a lot of the data. Then we thought, we've got to do this again a year later. What is happening here? In New South Wales, we went back to face-to-face, and then another lockdown, and then with again face-to-face teaching. Whereas in Melbourne, there was just this prolonged lockdown. In Japan too, very long lockdowns, and so we interviewed the teachers on Zoom. What was interesting, the teachers that went back to face-to-face teaching, almost immediately pronunciation resurfaced. Okay, so they reconnected with their students in class, even though a lot of them were still wearing masks. Pronunciation teaching came back. And that we were excited about this. So, okay, good. At least it didn't die. It's still there, right? In some form. And then now 10 years down the road, again, I mentioned we interviewed the students again 2 years after the sort of pronunciation emerged or re-emerged. We noticed that these professional trajectories of these teachers have even grown further apart, and their pronunciation teaching has sort of contextualized even further. Cool. Okay. Now, I thought instead of just providing a lot of data and stuff, I'm going to try and draw up these trajectories, and I used Canva, a program here, and these slides are very wordy, but I'm going to hone in on these red parts to show you a little bit what was happening with these teachers, particularly in light of their pronunciation practices. So let's have a look. 2013, that's the Japanese teacher. She came to Australia with quite a lot of teaching experience, 5 years of teaching English in high school. But she had very limited experience in terms of pronunciation teaching. Then she went through the course, and she told us that taking the course gave her confidence. She became confident. She started to believe in her ability to teach pronunciation in the classroom. And she was very keen on teaching prosody, suprasegmentals, like rhythm, stress, intonation in the classroom. And she also was very interested in any sort of movement, gestures to teach pronunciation. Then she went back to Japan, and as I said, she used a lot of different types of techniques, ranging from language awareness to controlled, guided, and free techniques. She used a lot of, she used phonics, she used technology like videos. In class, they had a little screen up at the top. She had students repeat after herself. She had question and answers. The students, making their own questions, working on intonation and so on. And primarily, she focused on sounds, consonants, word stress, and sentence stress and some intonation. Then I went to Japan in 2018, observed her twice, talked to her, interviewed the students, gave them a questionnaire and so on. And we labeled her approach basically a pre-planned and phonics-based approach. So she went into class knowing exactly what she was going to do and focused on phonics, but again, very much using different stages of language awareness, controlled, guided, free practice. What she also told us, she really struggled with providing feedback to her students because remember, Japanese, they don't necessarily, it might be a bit of a stereotype, but they don't necessarily like to be singled out, right? So if a student said something, she didn't want to correct them individually, so she corrected them as a group, but she really struggled with that, how to do this effectively. Then lockdown, she was the one where there was no teaching for 2 months, no pronunciation teaching at all, essentially because of the lack of technology, access to technology. She felt very lonely, isolated. She also said she was quite depressed. Then back to face-to-face teaching. Immediately, pronunciation teaching reemerged, and now they had some sort of technology available in the class. In fact, they upgraded a lot of the technology in the classroom. They started using Google Classroom and some of the so they became a bit more savvy. They learned, I guess, maybe like many of us, you got better at using technology as you went on. And last year, I talked to her, and what she told us was she expanded her repertoire now. She started using shadowing. Many of you know Yo Hamada's work, maybe. He's one of the shadowing guys. The students shadow you, the instructors. She started using that, which also makes sense in a Japanese context with a whole class. And professionally, she wanted to try something new and started working as an English coach, in which she she had one-on-one consultations with Japanese adults, and she worked a lot on their pronunciation, and among other things like grammar and writing, whatever the students needed. But then she took her junior high school teaching experience into the coaching world and started applying there. So her trajectory sort of took somewhat an unexpected turn here. Very interesting. What about the guy teaching, the Iranian teacher that's taught in Melbourne? He was self-taught. He had 8 years of experience in Iran, owned a language school, and he came to Australia. He started very confidently. He actually told us that he didn't think this pronunciation course had anything new to offer to him. And within about 3 or 4 weeks, he started to realize how little he actually knew about, for example, intonation. He also thought that non-native teachers are much better positioned than native speakers to teach pronunciation. Then he got a job, finished graduate work, went to Melbourne, got a job, and started teaching refugees. And he started teaching using intonation in the classroom. But even though he said in the graduate course, he said, I'm going to teach intonation, I'm going to teach prominence, many of you know, maybe focal stress, prominence, the most prominent part in a thought group. He said he was going to teach that, but he never did when we actually talked to him about his practices. Then I went down to Melbourne, observed him again, observed his students, talked to students. He started working as an administrator, so his teaching diminished and he took more administration. And he focused on word final consonants, some intonation. But again, remember his pronunciation teaching approach was mostly done through the provision of feedback. Pandemic hit, everything stopped. Pronunciation became irrelevant. He had to look after his teachers. He took on more administration. Workload was excessive. He really struggled with it. A year later, still Melbourne, that was the world's longest lockdown. the still online pronunciation teaching was invisible, in part because his students, the adult refugee students, a lot of from Syria, from Afghanistan, from other parts of the world, Libya, their English proficiency was low. It was just almost impossible to, in his words, almost impossible to teach pronunciation. Last year, interestingly, pronunciation didn't feature in his program. He took on professionally, he took on a new challenge. He was on a secondment in a different apartment, came back, had to cover for his boss. And so he basically moved away from teaching and became more, sort of higher level administrative pronunciation, sort of took a step back. What about Lucy? She was, again, a totally different story. She was the one that taught at Intensive English Center, very experienced going into the program, loved pronunciation during the course. She really believed in suprasegmentals, but she was still relatively unsure about how to teach pronunciation. In the classroom then at the Intensive English Center, as I mentioned, very teacher-focused pronunciation instruction, control techniques. When we observed her, she focused on segmentals. She thought repeat after me was ineffective, which was interesting. But then her practices somehow have reflected that a little bit. Not a criticism, just an observation. COVID hit. Pronunciation teaching, again, as the previous quote showed, became irrelevant. The focus was on student well-being. Then you got to remember that in Australia, many parts around the world, Australia, the borders were closed. No international students came in. That meant teachers in intensive English centers were all laid off. They had no more work. So she got laid off. She started working at a high school. And she loved that job. She started working with international students as she had pronunciation sessions with these students. Pronunciation regained in prominence. Very important was the relationship with his students, right? But unfortunately, a year later, when we talked to her last year in December, she had lost that job again. So that really took a toll on her emotionally. And she had then returned to the English Intensive Center, started teaching there again, but she was quite deflated. She had poured her entire life into these high school students, losing the job. And she not only took a toll, but she felt sort of demotivated. Pronunciation was sort of ad hoc. It was just sort of done. So yeah, we're doing it, but there's not much time to do it. There's, we focus on final consonants, but really the priority is on grammar and teaching academic writing and other skills. How about Georgia? She's the one that I mentioned. She taught a pronunciation seminar for graduate students and PhD students. She was, again, very experienced going into the program. She began to see real value in non-native speakers teaching pronunciation. I guess that was a very strong theme in the course. She started using some haptic techniques, which is remarkable because she doesn't like moving around. She feels very self-conscious. She's anxious about movements, but she started using them with her students. So she really went out of her comfort zone, noticed an improvement in the students, and said, I'm going to do this in my writing classes, which was quite interesting. So she started teaching pronunciation in her writing classes, as you see here when she did the narrative frame. And then she moved away from teaching. She took on a student advisory role, but as I said, she taught that pronunciation seminar because she just loved pronunciation teaching, and she used a lot of suprasegmentals because she thought that was the main thing these doctoral and master's and doctoral students needed to become more intelligent. The pronunciation seminar, unfortunately, ended when COVID hit, like many things ended. She went into overdrive, basically workload just increased, student well-being became such a huge issue. Lockdowns stopped. The lockdown stopped. She moved back to face-to-face meeting with these students. But unfortunately, somebody else was given the pronunciation seminar. So again, it took a little bit sort of demotivated her, and she started working as a lifeline crisis support worker, meaning it had nothing to do with teaching ESL. She just wanted to help people. And that was a very strong theme throughout her trajectory. She wanted to help people in need. She's still passionate about pronunciation, as we found out last year. And apparently her boss just asked her to do a pronunciation lunch session. So she was really excited about that. So her passion is still there, even though she's no longer teaching. So you can see how these four trajectories were really quite different from each other, which is really, really quite intriguing. Now, this is a slide I don't want to talk about, but what we found was what shaped these trajectories. The pronunciation course shaped the trajectories really, really substantially. Emotional turmoil, so the toll it took on these teachers, emotion during the lockdown was really, really profound. It really shaped what they did and how they, conducted their classes and what they believed about what was teaching all about. The limited access to technology during lockdown really also shaped them very much. But their love and desire to help and support students drove them. And we're looking at grit at the moment. I know some people like, I think Dustin Crowther in Hawaii, he's looking at grit and pronunciation teaching. So we're looking at that too as a possibility to possibly explain what's happening with these teachers and why pronunciation re-emerged after the lockdown. Starting something new and gaining new skills also maintained their interest and continuing to be excited about what they're doing. Workload, time, curricular constraints, all these factors shaped them. Learner needs really shaped them. What do my learners need? What goals do they have? What a lot of Southeast Asian students, they taught, the teacher said, well, they need final consonants. They need that. So that shaped their pedagogy quite profoundly. Empathy, really caring and worrying about students' well-being was very strong. Resilience, another theme I'm looking at right now. Very strong, very hotly debated topic in TESOL at the moment. And colleagues, that's red and green. As you notice, the red ones they negatively shape these teachers, whereas the green ones positively shape the teachers. Colleagues in some ways shape them negatively, but also positively. It's quite interesting. And these quotes, I think, capture what these teachers experienced and have experienced in the last 10 years. The Japanese teacher says, I love teaching because I can see the students, how they change, not only pronunciation, but holistically, how they change, how they learn. That makes her very happy. Rio, the Iranian guy, says, I want to put myself out of the comfort zone. I want to grow professionally. That keeps me going. Even though he didn't teach pronunciation, he wants to do something new, learn something new. Georgia, the lady, the student advisor now, she's helping people. That's what really drives me. And Lucy, the teacher that was at the intensive English center, lost her job, went to the high school, lost her job, came back to the intensive English teacher. She says she's just really invested in the well-being of students. That's probably the most important and the most important factor that keeps pushing her on. And that quote here, I think, is really the essence of who these teachers are. What they do is the students are the center of everything they do. I just love that quote, right? It's not important. Administration's important. Lockdown's important, blah, blah, blah. Really, your students is what we care about. You might ask, so what, right? Now, bit of a story here. I think no matter how good we are as teachers, right? Certain things we cannot control, right? Stuff, I was going to use a different word, but I'm polite. Stuff happens, or put differently, context shapes pronunciation teaching very profoundly, as I think we can see in the study. But I think we, and I'm saying here, we teacher educators, I think we need to prepare the students better to navigate context and challenges, even though we may not know what these challenges are, but we need to discuss with them. So what are you going to do if you suddenly have to teach online. And I think these teacher profiles we're writing here, they may be good case studies to discuss with trainees, student teachers. The pronunciation pedagogy was perceived to be beneficial, but I also think we need to prepare teachers better to teach pronunciation online. I don't think we know how to do this. I think the Journal of Second Language Pronunciation has just a special issue coming out, or I think the call's gone out about technology and pronunciation teaching. So I think we need to prep. I need to do a better job to prepare my graduate students how to use technology and how to teach pronunciation online. And maybe we need to revisit this three-dimensional model again. We need more longitudinal studies, I think, in different contexts. And a piece of advice for us teachers, I think, would be know your learners, know their needs, know their goals, then adjust your pedagogy accordingly. And maybe try something new to challenge yourself to stay motivated, to keep going. And lastly, there's a lot of recent work shows. I think teaching is an emotional journey, and pronunciation teaching very much so too. And so now over to you. Hopefully we got time for questions, and I'm going to unshare the screen and we'll just have a bit of a chat. Cool. All right. Are there any questions in the chat?
Yeah, there's a question from Michael Ross. Go ahead, Mike. Why don't you and the other mic. Mr. Mike. Oh, just name a haptic technique, Michael. We're going to have more on haptic pretty soon.
Yeah. And again, yeah, that's a huge question.
Yes,
Michael, get in touch. We can talk via email or even on Zoom that if you're interested. But basically, to show you one that one of the teachers used frequently was what we call the butterfly technique to look at to work on weak and strong syllables. And so it looks like I've got a bit of limited space here, but it looks like something you have and that's Amanda and I've written this up in the English Australia Journal, and so I'm happy to share that article. It's open access. Weak syllables are here, strong syllables are here. So it would be something like a word like banana would be ba-na-na. So weak, strong, weak, strong, weak. So the students tap on the weak syllables and also tap on the strong syllable, and that really helps them to experience primary stress or word stress for one, but also how these weakly stressed syllables are compressed, right? So we're trying to foreground the word stress here. So that's what we're doing here with these haptic techniques, where we use movement, touch in a very systematic ways. And there's a number of other things to teach intonation, prominence, and so on and so on. But again, get in touch if you would like to know a little bit more information.
Yeah, we'll have a whole session on haptic.
Oh, great.
Okay, well, next session that I'm doing will be about embodied pronunciation, and then
great.
we have our Bill Acton come on in the months to come.
Brilliant.
You know.
Yeah.
Why don't we go to your study? We have a question here about the type of questions that the self-reported data. You know, can you say something more? What did you ask them to do? Did you ask the student to take?
Yes. Yeah, we used the narrative frame. And one of the key people here is Gary Barkhuizen at the University of Auckland. He's really the narrative frame guy. And a narrative frame is you give a sentence starter, and then the students or the teachers finish that sentence. And so we gave them a frame, meaning we gave them about a dozen or so starters, and then they finished telling us that story. So it becomes basically a story about their pronunciation teaching. So say an example would be, I teach pronunciation to my students, and then they finish the sentence. Or I really struggle with, right? And so then, and it's a Word document, so the teachers can write as much as they want. Some of them wrote half a page, some of them did a page, some of them wrote more. It just becomes, it grows, right? Because it's a Word document. And then you can look at that and code it thematically. And that's why we said it's self-reported, because I couldn't go in and observe them. They reported to us what they were doing. Then in the next phase, we were able, because I got that grant, we were able to observe them and see what they were doing. And they very much, what we saw, very much aligned with what they reported earlier, a couple of years earlier on.
Now, one of the questions that came up is, how can the non-native speakers, we understand that there is controversy about that term, believe
Yeah.
Speakers who are teaching pronunciation are better at it than native speakers? There's some reasons for it. Give us a couple of reasons.
Huge with confidence. And there was 2 or 3 things. There was a good number of native speakers, and the majority of the graduate students were from Japan, from Indonesia. Some were from the Pacific. We had Thai, Cambodian, Iranians. We had all sorts of teachers from all over the world, and also Australians and a couple of North Americans. They were working very intensively together. So they could see, these non-native speakers could see, oh, you Australians, you actually find this much more difficult than we do. They realized, you don't know what intonation is. That's weird. We always thought your language awareness and knowledge is so good, yet you don't know much about it. That really gave them in return, that boosted their confidence, and they realized, oh, we can do this. Particularly the experienced teachers going in, they were able to connect their previous experience with theory and research. They said, oh, now I know why I did it. Oh, now I know why I didn't do it and what I have to do it in my future classes. So confidence was massive. They really took what they learned on board, and they felt like, oh, I do have the ability to teach pronunciation, even though my English is not perfect. We said, what is perfect English? Nobody speaks perfect English anyway.
I think that has a lot to do with when you are actually learning, you are reaching out to something and making those things go in your brain like, oh, there are some comparisons we can make. Whereas if you're acquiring it, you're just sort of like osmosis. You don't
Yes.
really pay attention to any of that. But when you go to the trouble of finding out, then you have an anchor, you have a better support system. So that's very strong for those who are non-native speakers of any language to be the teacher of that language. And we know that among us, we have the best teachers who are much more aware of what students need to learn, some key points. Let's just take one more question, and it has something to do with your students. Did they ever have, after they left your class, did they have any more professional development, teaching pronunciation? Did they learn about pronunciation anymore after your class?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I failed to mention that. Yes and no. What was really interesting was that connecting with us researchers, or staying in touch with us researchers, was very much perceived to be as professional development. Interviewing them, or initially doing the narrative frame, and then interviewing them every couple of years, staying in touch with us, meeting with us face to face or on Zoom, that was perceived. And I think there's a different paper here, a different study altogether. They perceived this to be very valuable because they could revisit what they were learning in the class. They were able to talk about, so I'm teaching final consonants. What do you call that again? Da. And so there's this professional dialogue, very much. It was a professional development session. So initially we thought, well, this is just a research tool, but it was much more than that. For them, this was an opportunity to learn and to discuss and to ask us too. It wasn't just me asking questions about their practices. They asked questions in return. And so as a result, over the last 10 years, these teachers became friends, right? They're no longer research subjects, much deeper than that now. So that was professional development for them. In terms of conferences, some of them have attended conferences. Some of them have done professional development that had nothing to do with pronunciation. Other areas of teaching, how to teach refugees effectively. There's department courses like that. A couple of them have done that. But real pronunciation specific PD, no, they haven't done that, which I find really interesting. But maybe it's a sign that there's just limited opportunities still out there.
Well, it's absolutely important that you said that you're having kept in touch with them over this long period of time. Certainly that's professional development. I can see totally how they would accept that as a way to, I mean, like, how many of us actually think about what we learned in college and say, oh, am I putting that into practice today in my teaching? I mean, like that, some of it, you know, we feel so far away, but you keep bringing it up and they have to think about it. They have to write about it. They have to reflect on it. All of that reflection and writing about it is so important, right? And that has helped a lot in their own development. When you're aware of what you are doing and why you are doing it, how you are doing it, and how you might do it differently, that is very motivating. And I'm sure that helps teachers become more involved in their, you know, day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month sort of activity in helping students.
Yeah, I totally agree, and that really helped me understand the importance of it's not, you know, I'm a researcher in that sense, but it's much more than that. It's way more important, not just collecting data, but it's that professional dialogue that we can learn from each other. That's really, really important.
Yeah, awesome. That's great. Well, you know, it's been a wonderful time spending with you and these questions, and I would like to just thank you so very much for
My pleasure.
giving us this opportunity to see your case studies and think about the trajectories that maybe, you know, like we will reflect on our own trajectory. Isn't that a good idea for us to do? To think of how did we get to where we are now, and how might doing this type of reflection help us as we both go back into our classrooms. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
And for those of you who are looking forward to our next top presentation, mark your calendar for March 22nd, and we'll be sending information out to you about it. Especially if you are members, you will definitely get it. If you're not yet a member and you want to be on the e-list, maybe Patrick, could you just put that in the chat one more time for those of you who are non-members and would like to know what's going on next month and what's coming. Thank you all so much.